Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's HAI weekly seminar. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Juan Carlos Niebles. I'm a senior research scientist at the Stanford AI Lab, and I'm also a member of the AI Index Steering Committee. And I'll be moderating today the QA portion at the end of Jiajun's talk. To ask questions, please visit the HAI Events Hub, where you will find the webpage for Jiajun's talk today. And you can click on Join the Conversation link for today's talk. You may also see the QR code in the screen here, and you can point your phone at that, and it will directly send you to the Slido webpage where we'll be managing the QA. So today I'm very pleased to introduce Jiajun Wu. Jiajun is an assistant professor of computer science at Stanford University, and he's working on computer vision, machine learning, and computational cognitive science. We're so thankful to have him today to talk about his work today. So without further ado, Jiajun, please take it away.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Juan Carlos, and thanks for inviting me here. Let me try to share the screen and see if it works. Okay, so I'll just start. Thanks again for inviting me here, and very honored to present at this HAI seminar. As Juan Carlos said, I'm a new assistant professor of computer science at Stanford. I just started in July, so a few months ago. Very exciting to be part of the community and to see potentially all the connections, especially after giving this talk. So my work, or the title of the talk, is going to be learning to see the physical world. So we humans live in a physical world, and we, as humans, effortlessly see the world and navigate in the world and interact with objects in the world. Right. So from a picture like this, a tower of blocks, we can imagine tower is going to fall. We can imagine how we may do to stop the tower from falling. So as AI researchers, we want to build machines that have such abilities. So let's first review what we humans can do, but in particular in the context of a very popular game that is the game of Jenga. Interestingly, not only adults can play the game, but even just a 6-month-old baby can do the game in her own way. So here is a video where we can see a 6-month-old baby trying to play the game of Jenga. Okay, looking at what she's doing, right? She played the game in a way that is different from how we usually define a game. But it's amazing to see that just at 6 months old, the baby was able to effortlessly see there's tower made of objects, understand the geometry of objects, and imagine what will happen if she interact with them, and to actually pick up the blocks. So in some sense, I sometimes say the goal or the theme of my research is to build such kind of infant machines. We put a quote here because infants can really do so much, and we focus on a subset of their abilities. That is for any objects, and especially for any new objects. The blocks are something that's very common to us, but maybe not as common to infants because they haven't seen much. And their world is usually like a pile of objects, like the one on the right. Many of them we may be familiar with. Many of them we, as adults, even have never seen them. But for infants, they're essentially the same, right? Every object is new, but for any of these new objects, they're able to see its shape and physics, predict what will happen if they interact with them, and to interact with it. So this is the goal of our machines, that can actually build an infant machines like this with these abilities. How to do that? We know there are all those fancy neural networks, which seem to be doing really well. And this is like a common demo that you can see. If you deploy a neural network, you can segment cars and trees and roads pretty accurately. And this is back in 2017. So now you can probably do even better. So on one hand, it's extremely powerful. On the other hand, it's also limited because it requires so much data to train. You have to annotate a lot of images, and it's not really generalized into any objects it's never seen before. Right? It can segment cars and trees. That's because it has seen millions or at least thousands of cars and trees in the training data. It's not really generalizing into any objects it's never seen before. But maybe you can say, if we wanted to scale it up to not only understand cars, but also any objects and their geometry of physics, we can just try to label all these attributes, like not only semantics, but also object appearance, physics, geometry, and even like concepts like actions. So this approach really requires you to scale up your data sets. So on one hand, it could be powerful if you can really acquire the data. they also bring significant challenge, that is annotations and annotations beyond semantics, right? This pixel is a car, is easy to annotate, but what's the geometry of the car? What's the physical properties of the car? What's the mass and volume of the car? Anything beyond any annotations beyond semantics are just so hard to obtain. So then we realize, okay, we are living in this physical world. So there's not only data, there's actually underlying physical laws, right? The whole discipline of physics. And they have studied what's the physical model behind or for our physical world. For an image like this, we know that we're seeing this picture because there are a number of objects, actually 4 objects, 4 blocks. Every object has its intrinsic properties like geometry, appearance, material, physical properties. Has extrinsics like its positions and lighting, positions and velocity. And there are scene descriptions like lighting and camera parameters. And putting all them together, this decides what we're going to see in the image. And the process of converting from these world states or physical model to the image is an important subject called rendering in computer graphics, right? So you can render an image like this from its state. You can do it not only for a single image, but for multiple images. And over time, right, across the states, there is dynamics going on. You condition on the current state, condition on my action. And here you can see, oh, my action is just gravity and what's going to happen in the future. So you can use that to explain and to synthesize a whole video. And by just using these physical models, they're actually extremely powerful because you can use them to make animations, make movies. And here's a fancy movie where it's made by a completely open source software called Blender. And just to animate, okay, look like a girl is chasing an animal. And the movie is made actually in 2010 or 2010. So 10 years ago, before deep learning was popular, you can just use your physical models to synthesize to make movies like this. So we're thinking about, okay, if we can try to use those models to capture every aspect of the physical world, like objects, intrinsics and extrinsics, and use that to explain what we see. So this kind of approach really relies on you build a very good model. Again, it also comes with challenges. What is a challenge? Most importantly, this is a top-down model, right? You're assuming what are object states like geometry and physics. You're synthesizing the image. But most importantly, or in our daily life, we're constantly solving the inverse problem. We're given the image, we're given the video, but instead we want to infer what are the geometry or what are the physical properties of the objects. So by having this top-down model, by being able to synthesize the movie, it doesn't tell you how to invert it, to infer the physical properties that we care about. And second, models are always approximate. Animations are great, but you can still easily tell it's not the real video. So they're only approximating every aspects of the physical world. So the theme of my research is thus to combine the two, right? Try to integrate learning with modeling so that you can get a power of both the data and the model. In particular, we can use learning in 2 ways. The first way we call it learning to invert. That is, we know we have the challenge if we want to use a model, then how to use a top-down model for bottom-up inference, for inverting object geometry and physics. We can use machine learning or deep learning to invert these physical models. But instead of, but these physical models are very important because they tell you what are the important intermediate representations you should build into your learning system. What should be the training target of your learning system? And the other direction, we call it learning to augment. We said models are always approximate, and most likely they're deterministic. But our world is stochastic. So we can use machine learning to augment physical models to make them more accurate, to make them more efficient, and to make them able to handle uncertainty. So hopefully, putting them together, you're able to get both the power of the data and the power of the model. And the key principle behind it is to think about what is the physical model that is governing the physical world, and to build those models for the physical world and use learning to learn what the model doesn't give us. Okay, so in the following part of my talk, I'm going to give a few concrete examples about how we may use learning to either invert a model or to augment a model. Let's start with a simpler case, right? We said we want to understand object and to have 3D geometry. So why don't we start with a case where we're given a 2D image, we assume there's only one object centered at in the image, and we just want to infer the 3D geometry of the object, 3D shape of the object from that single 2D image. Okay, so this is an inversion problem. So to invert the physical model, maybe let's look at what is the physical model in this specific case. So in an extremely simplified setting, we are seeing this 2D image because we know there's a 3D shape. And the physical model, the 3D shape, you can rotate it. You can see, it has like 4 legs. It's like a real chair. So, but the image formation process is actually, you have this chair, the chair is in a 3D space, and there is a light source. The light source sends out rays to the object, and then it hits the surface of the object and get reflected into the camera. In front of the camera, there is an image plane. So you're essentially seeing on the image plane a picture of the object. But we are really seeing from the image, right, the one on the left, is not a complete geometry, the 4 legs of the chair, because you can clearly see that 1 leg is occluded. You're only seeing 3 legs of the chair. So what you're really seeing are the visible surfaces of the object, right? So you're seeing the visible surfaces, the 3 legs of a chair, and you have such a strong prior knowledge that chairs must be stable, it must have 4 legs, and that's why you're able to imagine or complete a shape. So you can easily understand, okay, the geometry of the chair in the image, it must have 4 legs, but what you're really getting from the visual observation is everything about the visible surface of the shape in that particular viewpoint. So given that, we thought, okay, maybe we can design an inversion system like that to invert the physical models, but also in 2 steps. The first step is to do depth estimation. Going from a color image to estimate what is the depth map of the object, you can see that every point on the depth map, you can see depth map itself as a reparameterization of the visible surface, because every point on the depth map corresponds to a point on the visible surface. And the second stage is to going from the depth map to the full 3D geometry. This is a shape completion part. Here, you're not using any information from the input image because there's nothing input image can give you. And all you can do is to use your prior knowledge. I've seen many chairs. I know our furniture. I know objects must be stable, often symmetric. Chairs have 4 legs. So I should use one prior knowledge to complete going from this visible surface to give you a complete geometry of the object, which is a chair has 4 legs. So compared with the end-to-end system that directly estimates output, the 3D geometry from a single image, if we design a neural network or a system like this in 2 steps, first do depth estimation with a smaller neural network, and second do shape completion with another smaller neural network. You can train it on synthetic data sets like ShapeNet, which is a large data set of 3D cat models. So you can randomly sample all those cat models or 3D shapes from the ShapeNet, putting them in the random pose in front of a random background, and you can render all those synthetic data of images and shapes for training. You train this model on synthetic data, and now you can test it on real images. And these are images of chairs, which are not as common. So it's kind of a little challenging, actually. And compared with the model that's end-to-end system that directly output a 3D shape, which still gives you something that's quite reasonable, but missing a lot of the details, you can see that by having this simple change, building that map as an intermediate representation to have a 2-step system really gives you much better results. Especially, it captures more about the object surfaces, right? The details about object surfaces, which is really what matters to human perception of 3D geometry, right? So, but that intermediate representations really allow or forces the system to get better shape and get surface right. Here are a few more examples. So this is actually work a few years back. We published in New Rips 2017, but you can see that just essentially just this simple change, right? Having one intermediate representation, the depth map from the physical model, from how the world or how the image is formed, we're able to improve our performance on 3D object geometry estimation. Okay, going back to the infant machine idea, we're saying the infant's ability, or to them, the blocks or chairs, they're all the same because they have never seen all these objects before. So we were curious how our model generalized to objects that they've never seen before, to unseen object classes. So we take the model, we try to train it on 3 object categories: chairs, planes, and cars. These are the 3 largest categories in the data set we train on ShapeNet, which you can argue they are like the most common object categories, or at least the categories that you have the most cat models for. And you test it on the image of a table, which is the 4th common category. So still pretty, daily objects you see a lot. And the table also, just like the chair, their furniture still should, so they should share some similarities. But if you send the test image of a table into a neural network, and this is what you get. So I think this points out the fundamental limitation of a lot of neural networks, including this one, is the output, it doesn't really look like a table, it looks much more like an airplane. Why is that? Because the neural network hasn't really learned to complete a shape in general, but instead it has learned to smartly retrieve or find the nearest neighbors in the training set. So I'm given a table, I've never seen it, I don't know what that is, but the top of the table is thin and round. So in some sense, there are some airplanes that are like that. So I'm just looking at my training set, but okay, smartly finding the nearest neighborhood. Oh, airplanes, it's quite good. It's a good approximate. So I just output an airplane. It doesn't really have the ability to generalize, but instead it's memorizing what are in the training set and try to do smart but quick nearest neighbor retrieval during testing. This is not only a problem for our model, as I said. The problem of estimating 3D geometry from a single image has been pretty popular in the past few years. People come up with all the approaches using different representations like point clouds, voxels, multi-view images, or collection of surfaces, and they all have this problem, right? So for people who are interested, there is a CVPR 2019 paper on what do single view 3D reconstruct networks learn, which they analyze this problem in detail. Okay, so how to make models generalize to objects even they've never seen before, object categories that they've never seen before. So we want to invert the physical model or the graphics engine, right? So what is the physical model here? Let's take a deeper look. Especially in the second part of the system, the shape completion network is taking a depth map and outputting a 3D shape. We said the depth map is a reparameterization of the visible surface. So it's capturing some intermediate representations like surfaces. But to the end, the depth map is still a 2D image, right? It's still a 2D representation. So in the step of completing the shape or going from depth map to a 3D shape, the second network, shape completion network, is still implicitly learning to project depth back into 3D, right? It's essentially still taking the 2D depth map and try to back project it into the 3D visible surface. But we know from computer graphics, from perspective projection, that projecting depth into 3D is a deterministic and fully differentiable process. So we can write down all the equations, and they're all differentiable, assuming we know the camera parameters. So in that case, why do we have to make the shape completion network to be over-parameterized and relearning this deterministic mapping? Right? It doesn't seem necessary. If this is something that we know, we can write it down. They're fully differentiable and deterministic, and this is universal. That's very important. Right? Every image we're seeing, no matter whether the object in the image is a chair, plane, car, or table, or any other object categories, it's essentially projected from the 3D world. So every image is projected from the 3D world. If it's a universal constraint that we know how to write it down, it's differentiable and deterministic, why don't we just put it back into the system? Instead of having the network relearn it, we can just wire it in as a neural network layer. Because it's differentiable, you can still do end-to-end training, nothing is hurt. So now the system looks like you first estimate the depth, and then you back project it into the partial or visible surface in 3D. As you can see now, it's in 3D. It's a visible surface, it's a partial surface. But because it's partial, the fourth leg is missing. But then at least the second part of the system, the shape completion network, can now focus on just completing the shape in 3D instead of learning that back projection module or the back projection step. So just by making this change, if we take models trained on chairs, planes, and cars, and then again, we send it to this image of a table during testing, and this is what you get with direct prediction without modeling back projection. And on the right, you can see what you have by modeling not only depth, but also projection. Right, so just by having two important but also pretty simple changes to the system, by having intermediate representation depth map or surface representations, as well as a back projection model, those are things that we take from the physical model, from graphics engines. And these are important intermediate representations, constraints that we can impose in our model. We have a model that not only works better in 3D reconstruction, but also generalizes to objects they've never seen before. So this is the main idea behind our work called generalizable reconstruction, or genre, and joint work with Xiaoming Zhang and Jiajun Zhang, who are both PhD students at MIT. And this is also back when I was MIT PhD student. Okay, so let's do a little more testing on generalizing to unseen object classes. Again, we train them on chairs, planes, and cars, and we test them on bookshelves and sofas. So here you can see the results of a baseline, which is not too bad, right? It's trying hard to approximate objects they've never seen before, but because it's out of sample, out of distribution during testing, the results are not very good. If you compare them with our approach to genre reconstructions, we can see that still there are a lot of artifacts in the final reconstructions, but the model is actually trying pretty hard and give you something that's quite reasonable. It does look like, not before it was a table, but now it does look like a bookshelf and a sofa. Again, the model has never seen any of these. It has only seen chairs, planes, and cars. Okay, you can compare that with the ground truth, and still a lot of places that we may improve, but it's getting the most important structure or geometric structure of the object. We did a little bit of even more challenging testing. That is, what if we give the model, again, only trained on chairs, planes, and cars, but some non-rigid objects like humans and horses, right? So this is even harder. And here our model genres reconstruction, you can compare them with the ground truths. Again, a lot of places we may improve all the bumpinesses, non-smoothness, but it's impressive that the model was able to, just going from a single view depth map, to understand objects must be complete, roughly symmetric, and to give you something that does more or less look like the actual geometry of the object, the 3D human bodies and horse shapes. And again, it has only seen chairs, planes, and cars. It's never seen any of these non-rigid objects. Okay, so a quick recap. We have shown how we may impose or take constraints or intermediate representations from the physical model. In this case, that's the graphics engine. And most importantly, we're taking this, with surface representations. And David Marr, who is a pioneer in computational neuroscience, who suggested his own belief of how humans perceive the 3D world. But one of the important intermediate representations that he proposed in this perception process is the 2.5D intermediate representations called 2.5D surfaces. So by taking this such kind of 2.5D intermediate representations, which is universal, but also applies exists in the physical model of every images we see, we're able to combine them with deep learning system to make the system work much better and also generalize to new object categories. So this is an example. To me, I would say it's learning meets with the physical models, but taking the constraints from the physical model to make the system doing better in inverting object geometry or inverting the physical model in general. So what about the other direction? Learning to augment. We said here the physical model is graphics engine, which given a 3D shape and textures and lightings and camera parameters, the graphics engine is able to synthesize or render a beautiful picture. But here it does assume we have to know what's the geometry of the object, what's the texture of the object, right? But what if we want to synthesize an object that we've never seen before with unseen texture or with unseen object geometry? So can we use learning, but combine them, augment this graphics rendering pipeline so that we may synthesize and render new objects? So back in 2016, we extended the idea of generative adversarial networks, which I think is now quite popular. A lot of people have seen all those examples on using generative adversarial networks to synthesize 2D images, especially like human faces, right? Essentially you have two networks. One network try to synthesize whatever objects or images, and the other network try to classify or discriminate whether the synthesized image, whether the input image is synthesized from the generative network or is a real image. So by having two networks compete, the generative network, we're able to synthesize very realistic images. And we extend that to 3D so that you can not only synthesize 2D images, but also 3D shapes like new chairs that you've never seen before. More interestingly, we can take this 3D shape and then we send that into the projection module, the same projection module as before, but here from the other direction. Instead of back projecting a depth map into a 3D surface, we can do a forward projection that takes a synthesized 3D shape and then compute what's the 2.5D surface, right? The depth and the silhouette, but here we're just visualizing the depth. And then you're taking this depth map, and then you can, now it's in 2D, so you can apply a 2D image translation model like a CycleGAN, cycle consistency generative adversarial network, which allows you to translate a depth map into a real images of the object, right? So that you can synthesize not only 3D shape, like these new chairs, but also their corresponding 2D images, right? With the same shape, same viewpoint, but with textures. And here, this also gives you additional flexibility in controlling the images you generate, you synthesize. Right? You have this shape called shape representations, and then when you are given, when you're doing projection, you can control the viewpoint. And when you're applying 2D textures, you can actually compute or control their textures. So that this allows you to, for example, if I'm given a shape or if I'm synthesizing some interesting cars, I was like, oh, they look pretty good. But I'm giving some images that maybe I took from Google image search about cars, and I feel like, okay, these cars look so great, but what if I want to take the texture of this from the image of the car, but apply it to the shapes I synthesized? How would my shape or how would my cars look like in those textures? Right? This allows you to actually control such kind of rendering in synthesizing novel objects, but also applying the textures you want. So this is a quick example of how learning can be used to augment a graphics engine so that you can not only you can not only use graphics engines to render objects given their geometry and texture, but to synthesize objects with new texture and new shape. So essentially, we can put them together. We can say, okay, if I'm given an image, can I first do the learning to inversion process and also then do the learning to augment process? So given an image like this, right, I can try to invert the image to infer the geometry of the objects, but also infer their positions and attributes like textures. And then I can have some separate modules to deal with the background, which are not that object-centric, like skies and roads and trees. And then I can maybe do an imagination process. I would like, okay, if these cars are now at the center, but I want to understand, I want to imagine how it will look like, how the image will look like if I move them to the right. I can then change or edit my semi-interpretable scene representations to move the car to the right, and then send this edited image representation back into my augmented graphics rendering pipeline so that I can resynthesize an image with now multiple objects with everything else staying the same, background, weather, and textures, viewpoints. But the only thing that has changed is the position of the car. And now the cars have been moved to the right. So this is an example of how learning can be integrated with physical models for first doing inversion and then doing augmentation so that you can synthesize or change the image. Okay, so we've been restricting ourselves to static images, about learning, integrating them with graphics engines for inversion, for inferring object geometry, textures, and positions. But the world is dynamic, right? So from a picture like this, the tower of floor blocks, we can easily imagine that the tower is about to fall. How to build a model to do such kind of reasoning? A straightforward approach is I can just first do invert graphics, right? Learning to invert the graphics and then to estimate object geometry and their positions. And then I just directly send it into an off-the-shelf existing dynamics model or like a physics simulator. Then the physics simulator or physics engine can simulate what's going to happen in the future. And then I can send it back to the graphics engine to render what's going to happen in the future. So essentially, based on this idea, we just try to actually build a system that essentially does that. Given an image like this, and these at the bottom are what you can get if you don't have this kind of physical model built in. But instead, you take a neural network that takes this 2D image and directly predicts what's going to happen in the future in pixels, right? Without considering object geometry, without considering notion of objects at all, actually, and their 3D geometry and position. So the predictions are actually not too bad. It's pretty realistic. If you compare with ground truth, what's going to happen, it's roughly accurate. But because it doesn't have a notion of objects, doesn't have the notion that object has 3D shapes, in the long term, the predictions can become pretty blurry because there is a lot of uncertainty in what's going to happen in the long term. If you compare with our approach, then we can reconstruct the input image, right, by understanding object geometry and positions in 3D. And then we can send it into a physics engine for simulating what's going to happen in the future and re-render future images. And then I would say at least you can still see the objects are still objects. They still have the 3D geometry. The long-term predictions are not like 100% accurate with the ground truth, but it does give you a plausible prediction. And it also gives you additional flexibilities in controlling or understanding scene. For example, if I'm given an input image, I can reconstruct it. I can imagine what's going to happen if there's a wind coming from the right, or what if I push the object, interact with it. Or if I'm seeing an image of multiple objects and I know the object's tower is going to fall, then I can understand and reason about what are the actions I should take, the stabilizing force I should take to stop the tower from falling. We even tried to deploy it on a real robot. This is joint work with Chelsea Fing, who is also at Stanford, and also other people at MIT and Berkeley. So we have an input image like this. And if I'm a robot, I want to, just given this single image, I want to rebuild a tower. Then what are the things I need to know? I have to understand that there are 7 objects, 8 objects. And these 8 objects have different shapes, have different texture, color. I have to understand there is physics going on, how these objects will interact, so that to rebuild a tower or to recreate it, I have to start from the bottom. Right? If I start with the top blue block, then it's going to fall over, and I cannot really reproduce it. If I want to reproduce a tower, I have to start from the bottom. So just going from a single image, our object-centric invert graphic system with forward physical reasoning abilities are able to reproduce the tower from just a single image by understanding the number of objects and their geometry and texture and the physics. And we tried it on multiple cases. Here are more results. So it's not like 100% accurate. Going from a single image, especially estimating the distance of the object, the depth is pretty hard because we only given this cutter image, not the depth map. But still, in general, the system is working pretty well. Among these 10 cases, 7 of the attempts were successful. Okay, so here's an example about we can first use learning to invert a graphics engine and then sending them not only to back to the graphics engine for re-rendering or for image editing, but also to reason about the scene dynamics. But directly sending into a dynamics model is, on one hand, is powerful, but also there are a lot of things that are missing, right? For example, if I'm giving you these two objects, each of them have 2 blocks, they're stick together, so it's like really one object with 2 parts. They look extremely similar from visual appearance, but if I put them in a dynamic environment where there's external object hitting them, then you can see the outcomes are quite different. Why is that? This is because the top block of the first object is made of aluminum, which is much lighter than the material of the top block of the second object, which is made of steel, which is much heavier. Right, so physical properties really affect the dynamics. And this is something that's extremely hard to tell from a single image from inverting graphics because the appearance can be really similar. So here shows we might want to not only invert the graphics engine, but also to invert a dynamics model to understand not only object geometry, but also understand object physical properties. What else is missing? If I'm given an object, I'm putting it on the table, and I try to push it multiple times. And even if the initial condition is the same, the direction and the magnitude of force is the same, the outcomes could still be different. Why is that? Because there are all those tiny details like micro frictions of the surfaces, the textures, the bumpiness on the surfaces, which are extremely hard to capture. And if we cannot capture that, every model is approximate, every dynamics engine is approximate. It gives you a deterministic answer, but it doesn't capture the uncertainty in the real world. So dynamics is stochastic. And this shows we also may want to not only use learning to augment a graphics engine for image rendering, but to augment a dynamics model to capture the uncertainty in the real world and to make them more accurate, to make them more efficient. Due to time constraint, I will skip the learning to invert dynamics model part. I just give a quick example on how we may use learning to augment a dynamics model. So use learning to augment a dynamics engine. A dynamics engine, as we said at the beginning, it takes the current state, it takes the action, could be gravity, could be any forces, and predicts what's going to happen in the next step, right? The positions of the object and all those states. The benefit of such a dynamics engine is it's known and it's usually pretty good because people in physical simulation, in robotics, have spent decades building them, and they're usually very good. On the other hand, it's unavoidable that they have to make some simplifying assumptions, and most of the time they're deterministic. On the other hand, we can have a learner, these days usually a neural network, that you can take the current state in action and predict actually now more likely a distribution of future states. Right, so they can be more expressive, capturing a more complex distributions. They can be stochastic, but they're data hungry because they require a huge amount of data to train those networks, to actually learn the distribution right. And data, especially that involve dynamics, could also be hard to obtain. So to use learning to augment the dynamics engine, we just made a very simple attempt. That is, okay, we send the current state in action to the dynamics model, but then we send the output of the dynamics model as a baseline or something that the learner can leverage so that the learner is not learning from scratch, but instead is trying to learn the residue of the output of the dynamics model. That is learning to correct what the dynamics model has done wrong or what is the noise distribution so that we can make the output stochastic. Ideally, we were hoping that such a hybrid system can be more expressive, can be stochastic, can be also more data efficient. So it's capturing the best of both worlds, that what a dynamics model can give you and what a machine learning algorithm can give you. In more detail, the learning algorithm is implemented as a conditional variation of recurrent neural networks, which I'm not going to talk about in detail here, but it's essentially a stochastic neural network that is conditioned on the output of the dynamics model. And here is the output. So the red is the output of this hybrid dynamics model after for the outcome of the push multiple times, right? So you can see that it's really capturing the two modes in the output distribution of where the objects can be after the push just like the ground truth also has two modes. If you compare them with the baseline, which is, I think, a Gaussian approximate, try to approximate dynamics using a Gaussian process without using deep learning. Our output, using this hybrid physics engine is more accurate. So this shows it's better than a baseline that doesn't use deep learning, but also it's much more data efficient compared with the deep network that doesn't leverage a dynamics model, just directly going from current state in action and try to output the distribution of future states. So for example, here you're saying, if I want to achieve a relative error of 1% in the final position prediction, then our model requires about the red curve, about 700 data points to train, while a pure neural network requires a little bit more than 2,000. So you only require about 1/3 of the data that you require to train, that are required to train a pure neural network, right? So the hybrid system is much more data efficient because hopefully you're just learning something that's easier. You don't have to relearn, just like you don't have to relearn projection. You don't want to relearn the physical equations that people have developed. And again, you can deploy on a robot for manipulation. So here the robot is trying to solve a highly under-actuated problem. That is, I want to push the object on the left so that it in turn push the object on the right. So that the object on the right, the red dot, eventually reach the final destination, that is the green dot. Right. So this is a really challenging problem, but by learning such kind of a hybrid dynamics model, you're able to deploy on a robot, combining with model predictive control for solving this problem. Another aspect of learning can be used to augment a dynamics model, a physical model, but here is a physics engine, is you can use learning to simulate things that you cannot really easily simulate before, right? So here's an example where we try to use these kind of graph network, but also modeling the hierarchical structures between the objects. Then you can represent scenes as a collection of particles, which is like more universal representations compared with rigid bodies. But then by using learning to simulate how these objects or particles may interact, then you can simulate not only the interactions between rigid bodies, like the two disks we just seen, or the blocks, but we can simulate in this example how a pile or a fluid may interact with the rigid body. The fluid here is showing blue, and the rigid body is showing green. Right. So again, this is like using learning to simulate doing more flexible physical prediction. And also they're very fast. The forward prediction step is actually extremely fast. This is like, I would say, another example about how learning can be used to augment a physical model. Okay, so a quick summary. We've talked about if we want to build inference machines for any objects, including those we've never seen before, how we may build an AI system to see its shape and physics, to predict its behavior, and to interact with the objects, right? Really, much of them is inspired also by human cognition, right? So our idea is to integrate learning with the physical model, the states, and images. And the physical model here, most importantly, are the graphics engines and the dynamics engines. So finally, let me just use a few minutes to quickly summarize the other research I've done. This includes we're in the world, we're not only seeing objects, but we also have other modalities. We're seeing where we can hear the objects, or not really hear the object, you can hear the sound, you can touch the objects. So beyond seeing, you also have other abilities to interact with the world. And here's an example about how tactile data can really help seeing. So we've said we can go in from a single 2D image by modeling the intermediate representations like 2.5D surfaces for estimating 3D object geometry. But essentially, if we're doing everything from a single image, there's an intrinsic ambiguity, right? Because from this view, from the side view, it's extremely hard to tell the thickness of the bottle, right? So output of the estimation could be just too thick, which is really hard to capture from the single image. There's an intrinsic ambiguity from the reconstructions from vision. But if we can have a tactile sensor, we can sense, we can touch the object and feel how they will look like. Then the tactile sensors, essentially, they also give you information, again, about the 2.5D surface, right? It's telling you what the surfaces are. But it's not a visible surface, it's the, the tactile surface. It's a local 2.5D surfaces, which can be naturally integrated into our system for 3D shape completion. So you're completing from the local surface in addition to the visible surface from the images. And this gives you a better reconstruction where the thickness of the bottle especially can be better estimated. And further, if we want to go in beyond inference machines, from inference machines to child machines, right? You can not only doing seeing or understanding object dynamics, But as childs, there's language coming in. We're able to learning some level of abstractions, right? What are object categories? What are object geometries? We can talk about them at a more abstract level. Again, we're going to the shape as an example. We give it this input image, the table, and we can see the reconstruction is now pretty good. But if you look at a final reconstruction of the top of the table, then although now it does look like smoother, it looks more like a table, but we humans have such a strong prior that man-made objects like a table should have a round tabletop. Not like this one, it's kind of arbitrary, it's triangular, but not very irregular. But again, this is a very hard problem from a single image, because if you look at the image on the left in the middle, then the reconstructed shape from the input view, right, the same view as the input image, is almost identical to the input image. So again, there's not that much information you can exploit from the input image. So instead of you can do touch, but what are other things you can exploit? Some level of abstractions, right? We humans have a strong prior that shapes are often, especially man-made objects, they often have abstract program-like structure. For example, in the table at the bottom left, we know there are 4 legs, and the 4 legs must be identical, and also their layout must be regular on this regular 2 by 2 grid. So as a quick first attempt, we try to design, taking knowledge from program language and program synthesis, we try to design a shape domain specific language, try to explain using grammatical rules what are shapes should look like, especially these man-made objects or furnitures, how we expect them to look like. So that instead of directly predicting 3D shape, we can actually predicting 3D shape in this shape program space to explain them using shape domain specific language. And now you can see the output of the 3D geometry. It's much more regular and matches human intuition better. So putting them back into our framework, we're not only doing images, doing inverse graphics and augmented graphics to estimate the states, but we're really inverting this perception model because we can go from multi-sensory observations, vision, sound, and tactile signals. And we're not just doing everything in the raw state space, but we're also trying to invert the reasoning procedure to distill or getting some abstractions about objects are not just like a collection of points or voxels, but instead there are more important abstractions like chairs have legs, and legs, in this case, it's more like a cuboid. This process does not only apply again to the static environment, static images, static shapes, but the abstraction also exists in human actions. So here is, I think, a 5-year-old or 7-year-old playing the game of Jenga. And looking at what he's doing, he's first trying to identify which block is really movable, right? So for some blocks that are not movable, he just give up. And then he tried to find, blocks that are actually movable and try to use, to put it out. So you can clearly see it has a notion of not only the abstractions on shapes, like there are blocks, there are cuboids, but also the abstractions on actions, right? Some blocks actually just stop pushing it, but some blocks actually try to pull it. So it has a notion of different levels of actions or different types of actions should really capture or help you in manipulating the objects in playing the games. So going back to the picture we had before, we can first try to invert this multi-sensory perception step, going from vision and touch especially to infer object states. And then not only to discover abstractions like cuboids, but also to understand abstracting actions. What are the actions I should take? Should I push or pull? Should I give up? And use this level of abstraction to help us to do better dynamics modeling, to simulate what's going to happen in the future, to select the right actions. Okay, at a very abstract level, and I think this is pretty high level, given the time constraint, but just really by building upon this idea of discovering states, discovering actions, and building a conditional dynamics model, we're able to build this Jenga robot, which we're saying is like really trying to play the game of Jenga using many aspects like human influence, using vision and touch to feel whether a block is pushable or not pushable, discovering the action abstractions, and learning a dynamics model for different types of blocks, different types of actions, predict what's going to happen, and to really play the game of Jenga with this robot, but play it like a young child. This is really joint work with Nima Fazali, who is now assistant professor at University of Michigan. Back then, we were both PhD students at MIT. Okay, and now to finally summarize, so my research is really about combining learning with the physical model in the physical world This includes learning to inverting the perception model, graphics engines, but really perception model for shape estimation, learning to invert the dynamics model for physical property estimation, and learning to invert the reasoning model to infer or to discover what are the useful level of abstractions like object geometry, like action abstractions, as well as learning to augment the physical model. This includes augmenting the reasoning procedure to understand not only what the shape is made of cuboids, but also what cubes really mean. Why cubes refer to object shape, why push referring to that certain action instead of, or why cube is not about color, why cube is not about object texture, but instead of why is cube is about object geometry. Learning to augment the dynamics model so that you can make physical simulations more accurate and use it for planning, for robot manipulation, and using learning to augment the perception model so that you can synthesize novel objects, novel shapes, novel textures, and use it for image editing. If we want to go eventually from info machines to intelligent machines, again, I think the key principle here is to think about what is the physical model for this physical world. Now, in the world we live in, there's 3D to 2D projection, there is rendering, but not the nature render it for us, but still there's 3D to 2D projection, there's geometry. And there is physical models, there are Newton's laws, and there are abstract concepts like symmetry and repetition, and all these things we use to understand the world, to understand the scenes. And we should be really careful here because, from the many decades of AI history, we learned that if we're building something that is very restrictive, that it makes too much assumptions, then this actually hurts your model's ability to generalize, right? By building something that's very specific, okay, it may make you feel happier in this very specific domain that I can now do a little better, but in the long term, in general, it doesn't really help you. But what we are really building here, I would say, is arguably the minimal structure that could be useful for understanding world, but also the minimal structure should really be quite universal, right? Like 3D projection. Every image I'm seeing is a projection, right? It's a projected from the 3D world. So building that in will apply to any images. And through such kind of universal, but also very minimal constraint, will be able to help you to factorize or decompose the learning problem into smaller but modular, simpler problems, and to make your system learn better, learn more efficiency, and also to generalize to novel combinations or new scenarios for combinatorial generalization. So we want to build physical models for the physical world and to learn what any of these models doesn't give us. This is, of course, joint work with many other collaborators, advisors, colleagues, and younger students, undergrads at MIT, Stanford, and also other places, Berkeley, Michigan, Harvard, especially. Okay, so thanks everyone, and thanks everyone for listening. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Jiajun, for the wonderful talk. It's amazing to see this combination of physical understanding of the world with perception and AI. So yeah, let's jump directly into questions. I want to remind the audience that we are getting questions on the Slido website. So you can get the link on the Zoom chat box, or you can get to the QA through the HAI website and clicking on the Join the Conversation button for today's seminar. So yeah, so let me just start with my one question. So I guess this particular example you show at the end of the robot playing Jenga was quite interesting. And you connected the ideas of planning and trying to understand what effects an action may have when taken in the real world to the ideas of dynamics that you were presenting earlier. So I was wondering how do you see the relationship between the way you see the dynamics play a role here with the idea of causality, where you try to understand the effects and causes of things that happen in the world. So is causality totally enclosed within the dynamics view that you have, or is it bigger than that?
Right. Okay. So I think I would say this question is about two levels. One is just purely at the dynamics level, right? If we want to use dynamics here, we're just saying, okay, condition current state, condition actions, we predict what's going to happen in the next state. So this is a more specific definition. But in the long term, when we say dynamics, right, this also involves some causal reasoning about, okay, what is really, responsible for, after we can see, we have some work on like objects interacting with each other. And then we ask humans, what is responsible for the collisions between these two objects? And we want to build machines that are able to answer these questions. But this also involves things like counterfactual reasoning. What will not happen if the object is not there? Right, so I think there's a whole literature, especially I think very exciting within this HRI framework, because our colleagues in psychology department, like Noah Goodman and Tobias, who have done a lot of work, and also the philosophy department, Thomas Eichert, done a lot of work understanding what causality means to humans and how to build computational models for them. Right, so this is I think we're starting to do a little bit on that. But everything presented here is more at the current step, future step. So very small time intervals, probably not enough to understand any of the causality. Okay, but this is the first level. And I think at a higher level, I would say, it's even beyond just physical modeling or dynamics. It's really about this physical world. Why am I seeing, a cup, a mug like this? Because there's a causal model behind it. What is the causal model behind it? It's because there's a 3D geometry and the object has textures. And because the causal model can be, physics and how light transports, right? So there's lighting and all these things put together after projection, I'm seeing this image. Right, so in some sense, you can say the pictures we understand, we're trying to leverage our causal model for this physical world and why we are seeing the pixel the way it is, and to invert that or to augment it to build intelligent systems. But this is, I think, a more general response to the question. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. So let's go to some questions from the audience. One question is, why does training still occur at the level of objects, maybe pictures from ShapeNet? Wouldn't it be more flexible to train a model on a wide range of finer grain sub-object details, like flat surfaces, curves, corners, and so on, that would allow maybe a wider range of objects to be accurately reconstructed?
Right, so I think the answer is twofold. One is, yes, objects are still made of surfaces, right? So we're also and surfaces, they're like think about causal model. Surfaces have lower level details. So I think while we are not explicitly doing that in this paper, in the paper I presented, I think people have tried also to build models for more fine grained or more more factorized representations. Like in some sense, we can say the shape programs is one sort of that, because they trying to understand the parts. Objects have parts, and parts can be cuboid-like, can be rectangular. And people have also tried to use learning to make them more generalizable, so that it's not a cuboid, but maybe a learned representation, so that you can capture the finer details of the object shape. But on the other hand, I will also say, reasoning at object level or object-centric representation, which is now very popular, especially in the past 2 years. There are ICML workshops, there are new RIPS workshops, there are probably some CVPR workshops on that for a reason, because people have, I think, a lot of AI researchers these days, they also respect all those findings from psychology, cognitive science, especially developmental psychology, where people have tried to understand what infants have leveraged, what are the priors they may have. I don't want to argue if they're innate or they're learned very quickly after they're born, but they are able to, infants at very young age, like 3 months or 6 months old, they're able to understand the notion of objects, grouping objects that move up, grouping pixels that move together, connected to some object-centric representations. And just very quickly after, they're able to understand that objects have physical properties. They'll be surprised if physical constraints are violated. So so people have drawn inspiration from human cognition, especially from developmental psychology. I think, yes, CVPR once, I think they have Liz Belke given a keynote speak, right? So they have so I think there is a roots, or there's an inspiration, at least, from human cognition, especially from developmental psychology, on why we should use such a kind of object-centric representations for a lot of the reasoning tasks.
Wonderful. I guess that also touches to the idea of compositionality, right? And there's a related question here, which is, are we going to be able to recognize the different parts of an object with this kind of approaches? And I think, yeah, you may want to comment on that as well.
Can you say again, different types of objects, or
the different parts of an object? I guess before we're talking about sub-components, or maybe flat surfaces, corners, curves, and so on. But maybe you can go to a different level, which is subparts of an object, maybe the leg of a chair, right? And as I said, maybe this is another level of compositionality related to the previous one. So are we going to be able to recognize this kind of subparts?
Right. Yeah. So again, I would say, things like shape programs is try to like attempt to that from, try to explain object as parts. But I would say a major challenge of this kind of work is it's really hard to get annotations. But luckily, we have also Leo Givas as our colleague, who his team and I think Haosu's team together at UC San Diego, they have built very nice data sets. The ShapeNet, they're a major part of it, together with other people like Silvio. But then later they have PartNet, and then they now have PartNet mobility, where they try to annotate not only object shapes themselves, but also try to understand what are the parts of the object that are made of, as well as the mobility and how these parts can deform, how these parts can move, the degree of freedoms of these parts. So these are, I think, very important assets, because one of the challenge when we're training this shape program or developing this work is there's just there's actually no data set that you can use to train those systems. So we have to come up with our own templates for bootstrapping. But now with these large-scale annotated data sets of object parts, and then I think a lot of work will become possible. The shape program paper is inspired by earlier work from Leo's group together with Jitendra Malik group from Berkeley, where they try to explain the shapes as a collection of simple geometric primitives inspired by the earlier work in AI, like generalized cylinders and those works. But now I think with development of ShapeNet and PartNet mobility, there has been a lot of work. The StructureNet or those graphs from Simon Fraser University, StructureNet from Leo's group, where they have tried to understand objects at the part level, especially to understand compositionalities, and to combine such kind of template for object categories with learned, I would say, local descriptors for shapes as well. So I think that, yes, that's possible. And there should be some level of integration between understanding object structure and understanding the object, the part level primitives.
Wonderful. We have a few questions about the physical properties that we are trying to understand here. I guess you mentioned geometry and materials. I wonder, what are other properties that you may want to understand or capture? And there are questions about, are there ways to efficiently learn these properties? And where do we get this knowledge from?
What are the other physical properties you may want to capture beyond geometry and physical properties? That's very general. So what do you mean by other physical properties or other properties?
I guess you mentioned geometry and shape and materials, right? But
I think I mentioned something like physical properties, right? Like the density of the parts or whatever. Is it more about dynamics, or is it more about just physical object properties in general? Because one thing I think that's very interesting is about the BRDF, but it's not about physics. Or I guess it's about physics. It's not about dynamics. It's about how the reflectance of object and whether an object looks shiny or matte, and so capturing those information will be very useful, because you can re-render the objects in their different lighting conditions. For example, imagine how it will look like if the lighting has changed, and it will also have strong connections to object materials. Right, so I think especially now there's a lot of work on very interesting on combining neural networks with rendering pipelines. So to actually replace or part of a rendering with learned distributions of like object BRDF, so that you can actually synthesize, do extremely impressive, I would say, view synthesis. So if we can capture that aspects of object properties, that would be also very interesting. Although that's still more about appearance and less about dynamics, I would say.
All right. Well, I guess with that, we get to the top of the hour, and we're out of time now. But I wanted to really thank everybody for coming today and joining us to this event, and especially to Jiajun for the really wonderful and stimulating talk and conversation. It was really a pleasure to have you. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Thanks, everybody.